There comes a moment in life when you realize the person willing to leave you to die is the very blood you sacrificed your entire life to protect. I'm Caleb Montgomery. I'm 62 years old, and 5 days ago, my son called me in tears. It was the first time I'd heard him sob like a child in over a decade. 1 year ago, I was the one calling him from a hospital bed, my leg shattered after a brutal car accident on the I-5. Back then, he gave me a response that froze my blood. 7 months of agonizing physical therapy, 10 surgeries, and not a single visit from my own flesh and blood. They were too busy, securing a luxury condo and a private academy for my grandson. Now, the tables have turned. My son needs me to save him from total ruin, and my response was exactly 4 words. Words that didn't just break his heart, they ended the person he thought I was. Before I continue, if this story strikes a chord with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you truly value justice and self-respect in a family. Drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know who is standing with me today. 12 months ago, I believed I had engineered the perfect retirement plan until that semi-truck hydroplaned across the slick pavement of the I-5. It was one of those typical Seattle Tuesdays in February where the rain doesn't just fall. It creates a gray, impenetrable curtain that swallows everything. I was driving home after my firm's farewell dinner, a celebration of my 35 years as a senior appraisal specialist. My pension was secured, and my personal wealth was locked into a high-yield, long-term real estate investment trust, a fund that provided incredible returns, but was legally frozen for 5 years. I felt invincible, a man who had finally reached the finish line of a long, grueling race. Then, the world turned upside down. The sound of twisting metal was the last thing I heard before the cabin of my sedan collapsed. When I regained consciousness 3 days later at Harborview Medical Center, the silence of the intensive care unit was more deafening than the crash itself. I couldn't feel my legs. It wasn't the numbness of sleep. It was a terrifying hollow void, as if my lower body had simply ceased to exist. My doctor, a stern man with tired eyes, delivered the verdict with the clinical coldness common in American healthcare. I had sustained a T12 spinal cord injury. The nerve damage was severe, but there was a window of hope, an aggressive specialized neuro-regeneration surgery followed by 12 months of intensive private rehabilitation. The catch, as always, was the cost. My primary insurance provider classified the procedure as experimental, effectively washing their hands of the $300,000 price tag. My liquidity was zero. Because of the specific tax-deferred structure of my investments, withdrawing the funds early meant facing a 50% penalty and a legal battle with the board of directors that would take years I didn't have. I was a millionaire on paper, but in that hospital bed, I was a man who couldn't afford the very air he breathed. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone and called my only son, Tristan Montgomery. I didn't want to be a burden. I had spent his entire life being the provider, the rock, the one who signed the checks for his Ivy League architecture degree without a second thought. But desperation has a way of stripping away your pride. When Tristan picked up, I could hear the background noise of a bustling, expensive restaurant. I told him everything, the paralysis, the insurance denial, and the immediate need for a financial guarantor, so the hospital wouldn't move me to a substandard state facility. The silence on the other end lasted far too long. I expected him to say he'd be there in 10 minutes. I expected him to tell me not to worry about the money. Instead, Tristan cleared his throat, his voice sounding thin and rehearsed. He told me that he and his wife, Elara, were right in the middle of closing a deal on a new $3 million property in Queen Anne. He said their capital was stretched thin because they had just paid the non-refundable deposit for my grandson Leo's elite soccer academy in Europe. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask what the doctors said about my chances of walking again. He just kept talking about his own financial overhead, as if I were a client asking for a discount rather than his father fighting for his future. The most painful betrayal doesn't come from a sudden slap across the face, but from the perfectly reasonable explanation of the child you once loved the most. 2 days after my initial call, the door to my sterile room at Seattle Grace creaked open to reveal Tristan and his wife, Elara Montgomery. They didn't come with flowers or a sense of urgency. Instead, Elara held a sleek leather portfolio tucked under her arm as if she were attending a high-stakes board meeting rather than visiting a paralyzed father. My son looked everywhere but at my legs, his eyes darting from the heart monitor to the gray skyline outside the window, avoiding the reality of my condition with a cowardice that made my stomach churn. "Dad, we've been up all night crunching the numbers." Tristan began, his voice devoid of the warmth I had provided him for 3 decades. He pulled a chair close to my bed, but the distance between us felt like a canyon. Elara opened her portfolio, laying out color-coded spreadsheets that detailed their current financial obligations. She spoke with a rehearsed clinical precision, explaining that their adjustable-rate mortgage on the Queen Anne property had just spiked, adding thousands of dollars to their monthly overhead. She spoke about Leo's future as if it were a fragile glass sculpture that my medical bills were threatening to shatter. According to her logic, paying for my neuroregeneration surgery would mean pulling my grandson out of the elite soccer academy, an act she deemed unthinkable for the family's long-term legacy. I watched Elara's lips move, hearing terms like liquidity constraints and market volatility used as shields against basic human decency. Tristan nodded along to her every word, a puppet dancing on the strings of his own ambition. He leaned forward, his expression twisted into a mask of fake empathy, and suggested that I should look into selling my collection of vintage Patek Philippe watches, the ones I had planned to pass down to Leo one day. He even had the audacity to mention that the state-run nursing facility in South King County wasn't that bad, and that I could wait for my frozen investments to mature in 5 years. The air in the room felt heavy and toxic. I realized then that my son wasn't there to save me. He was there to justify his decision to let me drown. He spoke about hard choices while wearing a watch I had bought him for his graduation. Elara closed her portfolio with a sharp, decisive snap, signaling that the negotiation I hadn't even realized I was part of had concluded. She reached out and patted my hand, a cold, performative gesture that felt like ice against my skin, before telling me they would keep praying for a miracle. They walked out of that room with their heads held high, convinced they were the victims of a difficult economic climate, rather than architects of their own moral bankruptcy. I was left alone in the deepening shadows of the hospital ward, staring at the ceiling and realizing that the man I had raised had become a stranger I no longer recognized. In this place that reeks of industrial bleach and forgotten hope, I realized I didn't just have to learn how to walk again. I had to learn how to live without the warmth of a family. The public rehabilitation center in the outskirts of Seattle was a grim contrast to the sleek corridors of Seattle Grace. Here, the walls were a jaundiced yellow, and the sound of rattling meal carts replaced the soft hum of high-end medical technology. Because I lacked a financial guarantor for the premium facility, this was where the system decided I belonged. It was here that I met Julian Reed, a physical therapist whose presence felt like a lighthouse in a storm. Julian was a former Army medic with a prosthetic left forearm and a gaze that demanded effort, not pity. He didn't offer me platitudes about everything happening for a reason. He offered me a grueling path to recovery that my broken body desperately needed. To afford Julian's specialized one-on-one sessions outside the facility's meager allotted hours, I had to make a choice that tore at my soul. I contacted a private broker and sold my collection of vintage Patek Philippe watches, the timepieces I had curated, alongside my late wife during our anniversaries. Every watch was a memory, a silent witness to a life of hard work and love. Handing them over felt like betraying the past to survive the present, but I knew my son wouldn't be coming back with a checkbook. Julian watched me sign the bill of sale with a solemn nod. He told me about his time in the desert, about how he had to crawl through miles of sand with a shattered hip to find his unit. He told me that resilience isn't about the absence of pain, but about what you choose to do with it. Recovery was an agonizing millimeter-by-millimeter struggle. Every Tuesday morning, Julian would stand over my therapy table, his voice a steady, low rumble of encouragement. Focus on the big toe, Caleb. Don't think about the mile, just think about the nerve. On a particularly rainy Thursday, after 3 hours of failed attempts to even twitch my muscle, I took a break and pulled out my phone hoping to find a photo of my grandson Leo. Instead, the social media algorithm shoved a knife into my chest. There was a post from Elara tagged at a prestigious address in Queen Anne. It was a carousel of photos from their housewarming gala. The images were vibrant. Tristan laughing with a glass of champagne in his hand, a massive crystal chandelier glittering above them, and a professional catering crew serving oysters to guests who probably didn't know I existed. The caption read, "Finally home. New beginnings for our perfect family." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The cost of that single party could have covered months of my neurosurgery. I looked down at my pale, unresponsive legs and felt a surge of white-hot fury that was more potent than any medication. Julian noticed my trembling hands and the screen I was trying to hide. He didn't offer a hug. He simply placed his hand on the therapy bar and said, "Anger is fuel, Montgomery. Use it. Now try to move that toe again." That afternoon, for the first time in months, I felt a faint electric flicker in my right foot. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was the start of a war. I wasn't just walking for my health anymore. I was walking toward a day when I would never have to rely on a coward again. The Seattle real estate market is unforgiving, but it always has room for those who possess the sharpest appraisal eyes. Within the cramped, sun-drenched office Julian provided me at the back of his clinic, I began to reconstruct my empire one digital file at a time. Julian had connected me with an old colleague of mine, Marcus Thorne, a senior partner at a top-tier development firm who needed an off-the-books expert to vet high-risk acquisitions. My body was still confined to a specialized wheelchair, but my mind was as lethal as ever. I spent 16 hours a day staring at zoning maps, debt-to-equity ratios, and title deeds, finding the invisible cracks in multi-million-dollar deals that younger, faster analysts missed. It was during the 4th month of my recovery that a familiar name flickered across my monitor, the Pier 67 redevelopment project. This was the crown jewel Elara's brokerage had been aggressively pursuing for over a year. As I dissected the prospectus, I discovered a catastrophic oversight. Elara had failed to account for a dormant environmental easement that would effectively freeze development for a decade, turning the property into a financial black hole. She was advising her clients to leverage everything on a lie. Instead of exposing the flaw to her, I drafted an anonymous, comprehensive counter-strategy for Marcus Thorne's investment group. I showed them how to outmaneuver her firm by acquiring the adjacent parcels that controlled the utility access, effectively neutralizing Elara's position while making Marcus's group the sole gatekeepers of the project. The plan worked with surgical precision. Marcus was so impressed by my foresight that he signed me on as a permanent strategic consultant funneling six-figure consulting fees into a new private LLC I had established. For the first time since the accident, my bank account began to swell with liquid assets that weren't tied to my frozen retirement funds. I used that money to hire a private neurospecialist to supplement Julian's work, fast-tracking my mobility. We worked in total secrecy. While Tristan and Elara believed I was rotting in a state-funded ward, I was moving into a discreet, high-security condominium in downtown Seattle that offered a direct view of the very harbor they were trying to conquer. My days became a rhythmic dance between intense physical pain and exhilarating intellectual victory. Julian would push me until my muscles screamed, forcing me to stand unassisted for minutes that felt like hours. Then I would return to my desk to manage my growing portfolio. I watched from the shadows as Elara's firm began to hemorrhage credibility because of the Pier 67 complications. Every month, a fresh wire transfer hit my account, and every month I took a step closer to walking without a cane. I wasn't just recovering my health. I was building a financial fortress that would eventually become the gallows for those who had left me for dead. I kept my progress hidden, waiting for the perfect moment when my survival would become their greatest liability. The man they had abandoned no longer existed. In his place was a silent architect of their impending ruin. They sought me out only when their own ship began to sink conveniently, forgetting that they were the ones who pushed me overboard when I could no longer swim. 5 days ago, the heavy silence of my new sanctuary, a glass-walled apartment overlooking the restless dark waters of Elliott Bay, was shattered by a persistent frantic ringing. I sat in my ergonomic chair, no longer a prisoner of a wheelchair, but a man who could stand on his own 2 feet and watched the caller ID flicker with a name I hadn't seen in nearly a year. Tristan. I let it ring until it cut to voicemail, then again, and once more. Only on the 4th attempt did I press the button, leaning back as the sound of my son's ragged, sobbing breath filled the room. The arrogance that had once defined Tristan and Elara had vanished, replaced by a raw, pathetic desperation. Between gasps for air, Tristan stammered out a confession of total ruin. The Pier 67 deal, the one they had bet their entire future and their clients' millions on, had become a legal guillotine. Elara's brokerage was being sued for gross negligence and professional malpractice due to the environmental easement oversight. Even worse, the investment group that had seized the project, the one I had covertly advised, was now moving to foreclose on Tristan's Queen Anne property to cover the damages. They were days away from being homeless, their reputation in the Seattle real estate world charred beyond recognition. "Dad, please." Tristan choked out his voice, cracking with a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was a child. "We found your name, Dad. We saw you listed as a primary consultant for the Thorn Group. How is that possible? We thought you couldn't." He trailed off, the realization of his own ignorance finally catching up to him. He didn't ask how I had healed or how I had survived the state-funded ward he left me in. He only cared about the influence I now held over the people holding his leash. He begged me to talk to Marcus Thorne to use my newfound wealth to post their legal bond and save Leo's future. He spoke about family loyalty as if he hadn't traded mine for a luxury condo and a soccer academy deposit. I listened to him wail for 10 minutes, my expression as cold and immovable as the granite cliffs of the Cascades. I thought about the Tuesday mornings I spent screaming in pain while trying to move a single toe, and the Thursday nights I stared at their gala photos while eating lukewarm cafeteria food. Elara's voice joined the call in the background, her tone no longer clinical and sharp, but high-pitched and frantic whispering for him to tell me how much Leo missed his grandfather. It was a disgusting display of manipulative theater. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the fog roll over the bay. I told him I would meet them in 48 hours at a location of my choosing, but not for a family dinner. I gave them the address of a law office in downtown Seattle and hung up before he could say another word. The tide had finally gone out, leaving them exposed and shivering on the jagged rocks of their own making, and for the first time in a year, I felt absolutely nothing for them. The law office of Bradley Miller sat on the 40th floor of a steel and glass skyscraper, a place where emotions were stripped away in favor of cold, hard facts. I arrived early, walking through the mahogany doors with a steady, unassisted gait that echoed against the marble floor, a sound of victory they hadn't expected to hear. When Tristan and Elara Montgomery finally entered, they looked like ghosts of their former selves. The polished arrogance I had seen in the hospital was gone, replaced by bloodshot eyes and wrinkled clothes. They moved toward me with a desperate, practiced humility, Elara reaching for my sleeve, while Tristan began a frantic monologue about family blood being thicker than water. I didn't say a word. I simply motioned for them to sit across the massive oak desk from Lawyer Miller. "Caleb, please, the bank is giving us 48 hours before they seize the house." Tristan pleaded, his hands trembling as he leaned forward. Elara nodded rapidly, her voice a shrill whisper as she spoke about Leo being forced out of his school and the shame that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They begged me to use my influence with Marcus Thorne to drop the negligence lawsuit and to sign a personal guarantee for their outstanding bridge loans. They spoke as if my survival was merely a tool for their convenience. I let them finish watching as they exhausted every manipulative tactic in their repertoire, from nostalgia about Tristan's childhood to the supposed sacrifices they had made for the family. Lawyer Miller cleared his throat, sliding a thick blue folder across the desk. I opened it, slowly revealing a series of documents that turned their hopeful expressions into masks of horror. The first was my updated last will and testament, which legally disinherited Tristan from every cent of my estate, including my new consulting wealth and my frozen investments. The second was a set of promissory notes debts Tristan had accrued with secondary lenders that I had quietly purchased through my LLC. I wasn't just his father anymore. I was now his primary creditor. I watched the color drain from Elara's face as she realized that the man they had left for dead had been methodically dismantling their safety net for months. "You speak of family," I said, my voice low and cutting through the room like a blade. "But family is a bond of mutual respect, not a one-way street of exploitation. When I was lying in a hospital bed with no feeling in my legs, you didn't see a father. You saw an inconvenient expense." I stood up, leaning my hands on the desk to look them directly in the eye. I informed them that I would not be posting their bond, nor would I be intervening in the Thorne Group's lawsuit. They would lose the house in Queen Anne, and they would have to face the professional consequences of their greed. However, for the sake of my grandson, I had established an ironclad educational trust fund for Leo. It was managed solely by Julian and Lawyer Miller, ensuring that not a single penny could be touched by Tristan or Elara. Leo would have a future, but it would be one entirely independent of his parents' moral failures. Tristan let out a strangled cry of disbelief, asking how I could be so cruel to my own son. I didn't feel anger, only a profound, crystalline clarity. I walked toward the door, stopping only for a second to deliver the 4 words I had carried in my heart for 12 months. I looked him in the eye and said, "I owe you nothing." I walked out of that office and into the crisp Seattle air, leaving them to drown in the debt of their own making. As I stepped into the waiting car, I realized that true recovery wasn't about the ability to walk. It was the strength to walk away from people who only loved me when I was a convenience. My life was finally mine again, and for the first time, the horizon looked limitless.